Support comes from Bellingham's Whatcom Museum, the Pacific Northwest host for National Geographic's greatest wildlife photographs. Iconic images and behind-the-scenes videos on view through September 8th. More info at whatcommuseum.org.
You rely on this podcast to stay informed and connected with your local community, and we rely on you. Without listener support, this show simply wouldn't exist. Be a part of the team that makes this show possible by donating to our home, KUOW. It only takes a minute. Donate at KUOW.org or follow the link in the show notes. And thank you.
From KUOW in Seattle, I'm Diana Opong. This is Soundside. Each year, we can count on the reliable passing of the seasons. The leaves falling in autumn, winter blooming into spring, and if you're following tech, the reliable attempt, yet again, at a federal data privacy bill in the U.S. Congress. In fact, there have been so many attempts at creating federal policies around online data that just tracking them is an industry unto itself. There are entire websites dedicated to following the dozens of attempts over the last decade. Back in April, two Washington legislators, Democratic Senator Maria Cantwell and Republican Representative Cathy McMorris Rodgers, announced to much fanfare that they would be leading the charge this year with newly drafted legislation called the American Privacy Rights Act.
Privacy is not a partisan issue. According to the Pew Research, majority of Americans across the political spectrum want more support for regulation. I believe our most important private data should not be bought or sold without our approval.
That's Senator Cantwell in a hearing on the issue earlier this month, where she called AI fuel on a campfire in the middle of a windstorm. Her argument is that AI is an accelerant, providing the need for not just state, but federal data privacy policies, one regulation to rule them all. Here's Senator Cantwell again.
Researchers project that if current trends continue, companies training large language models may run out of new publicly available high-quality data to train AI systems as early as 2026. So without a strong privacy law, when the public data runs out, nothing's stopping it from using our private data.
AI systems are hungry for more and more data, and companies are asking consumers to provide it, often without ethical guidelines in place. But will that be enough to finally push tech regulation to the finish line? To hear more about this latest attempt and if this effort might make it through, like for real this time, Soundside's Libby Denkman caught up with Jacob Metcalf and Jennifer King. Metcalf is a researcher at the nonprofit Data and Society, where he studies and consults with companies on ethical AI practices. And Jennifer King is a privacy and data policy fellow at the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. Their conversation began with Jennifer explaining how AI has changed the regulatory landscape.
So we've been living in the era of big data now for over a decade. And so in some ways, this is just the next phase. But what I think makes it very distinctive is that artificial intelligence, AI, needs generally a lot of data, a massive amount of data in order to train the algorithms that drive it. And because of that, there is a humongous demand for data that I think goes beyond what we've seen in the last decade of big data, which has already been a lot of data. And so I think all of us are used to understanding, if not explicitly, maybe, kind of instinctually, that everything we're doing online is generating a data point in some way or another, and that our data is often being collected in ways that aren't transparent to us, that we don't always know. There's been a lot of surprises in the last decade. Health apps, I think, are one of those really useful examples where people have thought, oh, I'm sharing my data for one particular purpose. Oops, it's being shared, with Facebook, or in just ways that I haven't anticipated. Location data is another example of that. And we're seeing this a lot with large language models in particular, so things like ChatGPT. For those types of models, you need a tremendous amount of data in order to get the type of capabilities out of them that we're seeing. And already there is, I think, speculation and already potentially evidence that the companies that are training these models, have been scraping data across the internet in order to do it. And they've actually already maximized the amount of data that's publicly available in the English language, specifically to train them. So I was writing about this just at the beginning of the year, and already at the midpoint, I think we're seeing that the companies are trying to find even more innovative ways to try to find more content by which to train these different technologies. And so the potential for data collection in my mind, increases beyond what we've already seen.
Just to turn right now, Jacob Metcalf, we heard from Jennifer King about sort of why this moment is different. What is emerging right now for you in terms of what we see AI doing to the privacy space, and what kind of concerns does this moment bring up?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I think there's a couple really interesting questions in the background here. As Jen pointed out, we're sort of approaching potentially the maximal limit of available English language training data. They've scooped up so much, they want more, they say they need more. But there's actually a lot of dispute among technicians in this space about whether that's true, right? So yes, the OpenAIs, the Googles, the Microsofts, Anthropic, the major AI labs have really doubled down on this idea that bigger is better. But there's a lot of dispute about whether that's true. There's some really interesting work being done on smaller language models that don't require such massive training. There's a lot of question about whether the mission behind these labs is even coherent, right? The pursuit of artificial general intelligence. That's an artificial intelligence that can do generalized tasks. So you can ask it to do anything, and it is a general purpose knowledge that can solve many different kinds of problems like human brains do, but at a much grander scale. That's arguably an incoherent goal that large language models will never achieve, right? So where we're seeing actually like the most economically interesting and useful technology is like more purpose built. It's not built for achieve everything that we could possibly ever throw at it. Like historically, achieve everything we can throw at it is a very bizarre task for an engineer to consider, right? And so where a lot of progress is being made is in tailor-made models, right? That aren't intended to achieve everything, but rather are achieving something specific within a specific industry. So within medicine and drug discovery is really promising area, or material science, or supply chain management. There's tons of interesting things going on in these other spaces that are not built to hoover up every single thing that you've ever said in your life, every credit card transaction you've ever made, every bit of location data about where you go to church, where you go to school, where you go to the doctor.
I think that like what you're saying is, there are these promising things. Bigger is not necessarily better, but in the US, that's a big statement. For example, regulators to try to tell companies like bigger is not better. And then we, are going to step in and potentially limit the amount of, ambition that you have in these models. Let's get to regulation in just a second. I'm bringing up regulation a little early, but, Jennifer, you mentioned that these user agreements are changing, and that goes into this changing landscape about the ways in which AI has really leveled up the questions of privacy. Meta recently announced that it was changing its privacy policy in the UK to allow the company to access public posts for AI training. Other companies like Adobe have come under criticism for similar changes in user agreements. First, Jennifer, what do you make of the changes to these user agreements and how we should be reading them, and how people, again, just trying to go about their day, should be understanding them?
Right. So first, I agree with everything that Jake just said. Unfortunately, I think we're just not at the point where the small argument is in the public sphere, at least where our legislators are focusing. But we may get there, right? And we may get there because it's not feasible to collect all the data all the time. So there's all sorts of interesting ways that this can still play out, just to say, like, this future is not yet written, right? But in the immediate term, we are definitely seeing the companies pivot to cover their assets, if you'd like to use that term, to make sure that all the data that their customers are generating can be used to train models, in part because when you look at the set of fair information practice principles that have been governing data use for the last 50 years internationally, and not always very well, to be clear, part of the two kind of major principles that data processors in theory should be following are both data minimization and purpose limitation or purpose specification. And so To the extent that we are considering passing any legislation that doubles down on telling companies, hey, you need to minimize the amount of data you collect because it needs to be not, you can't take everything and you can't necessarily use it for whatever purpose you'd like. What we're seeing right now are the companies very strategically going, well, in advance of any law being passed, we're going to go ahead and make sure that we have the ability to train on everything we want. So we're seeing a lot of conflicts arise, with especially people who use either a free service, like let's say Google Docs, or a paid service, like a subscription to Adobe software, where suddenly folks are, seeing that the work they're producing in these tools is potentially going to be used to train AI. And I think especially in the creative sphere, this has been a huge concern, not even necessarily the personal data sphere, but for people who make their money doing creative pursuits, that they may see their intellectual property being, used to train models that then can output replicas of their IP. So it's a real concerning spot.
Let's talk about data minimization that Jennifer just brought up. Jacob, what would that actually look like if that was a goal that companies pursued? And is the cat just completely out of the bag on that?
No, I don't think it's completely out of the bag. Part of it is just an orientation towards what data is for and who should have access to it. So, okay, I write publicly. I have a lot of words that have come out of my brain that are in the public domain. And, I am resigned to those having been trained, using those to train LLMs. I don't love it, but it's happened. It forces a reconsideration of audience to some extent, right? I agree. We do what we do because we're humans who are trying to interact with other humans. And it is, in some ways, very bold of tech companies to imagine that they just get to intercede in that. Like there's sort of a deeper philosophical question, I think, about that it has just been sort of bulldozed over. But on a more practical level, data minimization could mean like, okay, well, Google's trained their Gemini on my public writing. To some extent, I'm some billionth of a drop of rainwater in that ocean, but on my Google Docs, I have my tax documents in there, right? There's no setting that I can click that says leave this out. Why is that? There's 1,000 other confusing settings in Google Docs about sharing permissions. Why is it that I can't mark private from AI on that, right? And so data minimization doesn't inherently mean that we've taken away 90% of their access to the data that they might want to train their models. It might be a very small amount, but it's the most sensitive things, right? It's the things that would be dangerous to us if they were somehow leaked, right? A lot of these models leak in unpredicted ways that are very hard to protect against. And so I think a very simple and straightforward form of regulation would be for regulators to say there must be a do not train setting that AI companies must respect, right? So you can put that on your website. There's a tradition of that with the robots.txt exemption, where if you put a little snippet of code, Google won't index your site, right? But that gets ignored by a lot of developers. Like, let's make this a law. It'd be very simple. It would allow people to exclude the things that are sensitive that they don't want into these models. And it really, I think it's a stretch to claim that would actually disrupt innovation in this space.
Speaking of this idea of being able to protect some of your information from tracking and being used in AI, there are provisions in this bill that Maria Cantwell and Kathy McMorris Rogers have put forward. And the biggest things that it has called for are the data minimization practices, this idea that companies are urged to collect as little data as possible. It also calls for a right to opt out of data collection, stronger security measures for protecting that data, and the right for people to take action legally, so individual consumers can sue companies for mishandling or wrongly collecting their data. Some states have this, like California has a version of this. Again, the legislation has hit some skids in Congress, has gotten a little bogged down. It's not clear. Cantwell has promised that it will be marked up in the Senate, at least, later this month. I guess I'm curious what you make of what we've talked about here and the latest attempt by Congress to try to bring some kind of federal regulation. And we'll start with Jennifer and then go to Jacob.
So this is a long-suffering process. We've been hoping for federal level data regulation, privacy regulation for the better part of a decade. And we've gotten tantalizingly close. The last time actually was 2 years ago with the predecessor to this bill. And I think what you're seeing is that, again, the current version, ARPA, very similar to its predecessor from the last congressional session. But there's a different group of characters in Congress, especially in the House. So I think what you're seeing with the skids, as you phrased it, is there are a different group of actors this time around who have brought different concerns to the table. And so, for example, the big problem that we hit a few weeks ago was that the bill came up for another discussion draft, and the civil rights provisions had been removed from the bill, as well as the algorithmic assessment piece, which of course would be one of the most relevant pieces to the AI space that we're concerned with. And that really wasn't in dispute in the previous version. So
that was from the House action took that out, or?
I believe so, yeah. So you're seeing some politicking here, and I will say I'm not entirely clear of the end game. But I think there's a couple things that have been really contentious. These two things were really a new kind of point of argument that came up. But prior to that, there's obviously been a lot of contention over the private right of action, so the ability of consumers to sue companies, and then as well, just the whole question of preemption, which companies very much want. And the consumer advocates, and especially the state of California, my colleagues over in the Privacy Protection Agency, really don't want to see, because that would basically take all of the kind of additional things that California has done, for example, and nullify them, because the federal law would place a ceiling on what states could do and not a floor, which is what both advocates and some of the states that have passed privacy bills would like to see.
I know, Jacob, you're a philosopher. I mean, you're kind of by nature maybe deeply centered in thinking about the way ethics plays into all of this. When you look at what's happening in Congress right now, does anything give you hope about people finally in this moment seeing a need to have a federal standard? Or do you see that, this is still going to be a really tough road, and, we're maybe just as far as we ever were? I don't want to give you force you to sort of game this out, but what do you make of where we're at right now?
Yeah, something that we find ourselves saying pretty often is that the effect of legislation that would require something like an algorithmic impact assessment or a privacy assessment, these are not for significantly non-technical assessments, right? And it essentially means hit pause and think about it, and then write it down, and then you're sort of obligated to engage with what you wrote down as you go forward and justify deviations from it. And when we were talking about ethics, that's really what we're talking about to some extent, is to say, hit pause and think about it and take seriously the interests of other people. And that is sorely lacking in Silicon Valley for a long time. And as someone with a PhD in philosophy, I want people to sit down and think a long time about a lot of things. But it feels kind of silly to say, right, it's the proper behavior in a corporate environment is to sit down and philosophize for a while. But really, these assessments are pretty practical. It's about knowing who your stakeholders are. It's about mapping out the consequences for the community. It's about tying it together with sort of commonly held principles, perhaps from the UN Declaration of Universal Human Rights, or from the US Constitution, or from our civil rights tradition in the US. And I think something that's really interesting, Jen pointed some of this out, and I largely agree with her assessment about why these bills have sort of been stalled. Typically, you would think the corporate battles between the regulators and the corporations are going to be about things like liability, and that's what would hold this up. But it turns out in the Senate and in the House, it's being eaten up by the culture war. It's that these assessments were the thing that were holding it up, because it's too woke to look at the civil rights implications of technology, right? There's this idea that even hitting pause for a minute to think about the consequences of this technology is somehow now forcing corporations to take a side in the culture war, rather than, making them actually think about foundational American values around freedom and privacy.
And isn't that the way with pretty much all legislation these days, that, this Congress and recent Congresses have been almost historically inefficient in passing legislation, and a lot of that is ground to a halt because of what you just mentioned. Before we go here, I just want to make the argument that maybe is not what's holding things up right now in the House, but is something that you hear a lot, like, for example, from Sundar Pichai saying we need more data to make these models better. And when these models are better, it's going to make everybody's lives better. You know, GDPR, the big privacy legislation in Europe, that is going to hold back innovation there. They're not going to see the kind of leaps and bounds that, you know, you see out of Silicon Valley and other places in the US because of this heavy hand of regulation. How do you respond to that the idea that the US has been relatively permissive in its regulatory structure has helped companies that grow in the US really get ahead, and that we shouldn't try to cut that off? Jacob, and then we can end with Jen.
Yeah, I mean, I want to challenge the idea that we know that this is going to make everyone's lives better. Right now, the best experts in navigating AI systems are people who are impoverished, people who are in vulnerable positions in our society, because so many government functions, from policing to child welfare to school access to welfare benefits to Medicare benefits, like, are you going to get a healthcare aid? That's determined by an algorithm, an unaccountable algorithm that makes a lot of mistakes. And if you're impoverished in the United States right now, and in a lot of the rest of the world, like in Europe too, where you'd think they have more protections, the bleeding edge of AI is making people's lives worse, right? The actual application of these technologies is making people miserable and more impoverished and more in pain. And so I don't take this claim lightly that it's just going to make everyone's lives better. It might make our lives better if we're intentional about it, if we take the time to think about the consequences of it, if we actually account for the different positionalities in our society. Like, it'll probably make my life better, but I live a very privileged life and I'm not vulnerable to these systems in the way that somebody else might be. But they're much better at navigating these systems than I am because their lives depend on it. Well, whether they get to keep their kids depends on it. It's really rather wild that we just sort of go through these discussions and ignore the actual consequences that real people are experiencing right now.
And Jennifer, before we go, what do you make of this idea, like that there is this maybe zero-sum idea of needing to keep regulation from inhibiting the growth and development of U.S. companies in order for them to stay competitive?
This is one of those areas where you hear Silicon Valley talking out of both sides of their mouths. You know, on one hand, we're all concerned about the potential, world domination by AI and, ending life as we know it. We had famously had a group calling for just a measly 6-month pause in the development of AI. And then on the other hand, we hear a lot of resistance to any type of regulation because it's going to somehow quash innovation. And, I color me very, very skeptical here. I think a lot of what's being asked for is fairly reasonable and is simply trying to take a technology that, again, industry's been very clear in calling potentially very dangerous and asking them to proceed thoughtfully and maybe not at the speed of light. There are a lot of national security arguments that get thrown into this discussion, and I think that can be a bit disingenuous as well, because it's not always clear to me if consumer technology is what we should be concerned about in terms of national security debates, for example. I find those arguments to be pretty underspecified when folks throw that in, especially when we talk about competing with China. And it's like, well, on what dimension are we concerned with exactly in our competition with China and AI? It can't just be all consumer technology, for example. So just to say, I'm very skeptical of them, and I think we're not going to see AI ground to a halt in places where regulations have been put in place. Certainly, Europe, I think, is not going to somehow become just behind the times. We've seen very similar arguments, for example, in a kind of adjacent space, which has been thinking about how to design technology for kids. In California, we passed the Age-Appropriate Design Code, which is a version of what is already been on the books in the UK now for, I think, over 3 years. And you would hear the critics of that talking as if, the UK was going to fall into a complete black hole and that nobody could ever access the internet again. And I'm pretty sure that hasn't happened, although I haven't been abroad since the pandemic. Just to say, there's a lot of kind of scare tactics, I think, that come out when we start talking about, in some cases, very reasonable ways to approach the technology as if, the only way to advance is to have absolutely no encumbrances whatsoever. And we've seen that in the privacy space for over a decade, that when you have no regulations and you don't put limits on what companies do, we get a race to the bottom. And we've absolutely seen that in the data privacy space, particularly with data brokers. And that I think is beyond dispute at this point, to the point where we do see the tech companies coming out and saying, yeah, we do need, some form of rules here. I would just hate to see the AI space get the same pass that we gave just data privacy and technology in, the early 2010s, because that has not ended well. And I don't think that completely not encumbering the emergent AI sector with any type of responsibilities will end well either.
It has not ended well for society, I think. I think it's also not ended well for competitiveness within these industries. Like, is it great that, for example, we've allowed Google to be the data king and therefore not allowed any other search engine to be able to have a chance at competing? These types of things I think are important. It's not just a competitiveness, argument abroad or globally. We're also talking about within the industries and the ways that a lack of regulation has potentially squashed, smaller businesses from having a chance. But, we could talk about this. This is never going to go away, or in the near future, not going to go away. I really appreciate your time today, guys, and I hope we can keep talking. Dr. Jennifer King is a privacy and data policy fellow at the Stanford Institute for Human-Centered Artificial Intelligence. And Dr. Jacob Metcalf is a researcher at the nonprofit Data and Society, where he studies and consults with companies on ethical AI practices. Thank you both for the conversation today.
Thank
you so much.
Thanks for listening to Soundside. And hey, this show is only possible because listeners support us. If you are able to give right now, check out the show notes for a link to donate. And don't forget, you can listen live on KUOW 94.9 FM Seattle at noon and 8 p.m., Monday through Thursday, or anytime online at KUOW.org.